Hello and welcome to Sundays at the Chateau, where today I would like to tell you all about my collection of Spode blue and white porcelain. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Stephanie, the chatelaine of this 16th century chateau in the heart of France. And if you love all things chateau, then please subscribe to this channel because every Sunday I talk about a different aspect of chateau life. Most of the porcelain in the kitchen is blue and white and we use it for everyday use. I really like blue and white because you can mix different styles, different eras, different companies, and it doesn't matter, it all marries really well together. And that's super useful in a huge house that often has 20 people eating in it because we get a lot of breakages. So trying to keep one perfect set of everything matching is really difficult. So this is a tip if you have a very big family or lots of friends who love breaking things, blue and white's a great way to go. My collection had a huge kickstart because just after I'd bought the chateau back in 2006, my parents and I went to Stoke-on-Trent to visit the factory shops. My father absolutely loved the decorative arts. He was an amazing artist himself, and so he would love going to auctions with me and visiting factory shops. He really liked porcelain. Anything artistic he was interested in, anything beautiful. So when we went to the factory shops, we were just running rampant, and my mother was quite shocked and felt that we should be calming ourselves down and not buying so much. But now I'm so grateful that my father was like that, because 16 years later, I still haven't had to buy any more plates for the kitchen. And also because every single time I take a plate out of the cupboard, it reminds me of my father. And factory shops were very important because I was on a very strict budget. We'd only just bought Lalande and I knew that enormous works were ahead of us. We needed to redo all of the electrics, all of the plumbing, put in about 12 bathrooms, change the kitchen, everything needed redoing. So I didn't have a budget for porcelain, but I did need plates to run the chateau. And often factory shops can be a very good way of finding things. I understand if people want everything to be absolutely perfect in their dining sets, but it's not really what I was going for everyday kitchen use here, because I knew that things would get chipped and broken and I wanted them to be fairly inexpensive but still beautiful so that I could replace them when needed. What we didn't realise at the time in 2006 is that Spode was on the edge of bankruptcy and about to end its 230-year run of continuous operation, which is extraordinarily sad, though luckily it's now been bought by the Porcelain Group, who are only 200 yards down the road, so it stayed in Stoke-on-Trent. But it did mean that the factory shop was unusually full of bargains. We didn't know why, but we absolutely made the most of it. And afterwards, I started to get interested in where these designs had come from, what was the history behind the plates, and what was the history behind the company. So that's what I would like to tell you a little bit about today. English china is famous throughout the world, and that is largely because of people like Spode and Wedgwood. Wedgwood and Spode both grew up in the area of Stoke-on-Trent and actually knew each other and apprenticed under the same potter, Thomas Wealden, who at the time was considered to be one of the most successful potters in England. And I would love to tell you more about Wedgwood and his innovations and his life story another time. If you'd like to hear about that, let me know. But today I'm going to focus on Spode. Whilst history is full of stories of people who achieved extraordinary things after being born into wealth and luxury, I think I'm most attracted to the stories of people who were born with nothing in life and who managed to make something of themselves against all the odds. That to me is the most incredibly impressive thing. Josiah Spode was born in 1733 to parents who were paupers. And not only that, by the age of 6, both of them had died and he was left an orphan. At the age of 16, he started working for Thomas Wealden, who at the time was famous for Staffordshire figures and tortoiseshell ware, which was very fashionable in the 18th century. Tortoiseshell in general was fashionable, and so plates that imitated it were very much sought after. Spode quickly showed extraordinary promise, and by 1776 he was able to buy his own pottery works in Stoke-on-Trent. And it was then that he became famous for developing and perfecting two aspects of the art of porcelain. In 1784, he perfected the technique of underglaze transfer printing, which enabled beautiful images to be faithfully reproduced onto various different shapes of porcelain. It was an extremely arduous process because each image needed to be hand engraved onto copper plate, and each copper plate took about 6 man-weeks to create and required extraordinary skill. And for each image, there needed to be many different copper plates because each of the bits of china would be a different size. So for a tiny milk jug and a plate to have the same image, you obviously need it in different scales. And because of this development, in the same year, 1784, he was able to launch Spode's first Willow Pattern. This was that original famous Willow Pattern. And a little piece of it is to be found in many, many houses around the globe. It's been especially popular in England and in America. There was a whole series of willow pattern plates, some of which, like this one, have been reproduced for the Blue Room collection. This is Temple with Panel from 1798. And this one is Temple Landscape, introduced in 1813. I use these two a lot, especially to serve breakfast to our B&B guests. And the company was still adding to the Willow series that they'd started in 1790. In 1884, which is when this one, Newbridge, was introduced. And those of you who've seen the video about the decoration of the dining room here at Lalande will know that we have a willow pattern inspired wallpaper in there. And the willow pattern has become extremely famous around the world. At that time, he was still using earthenware and putting his transfers onto that. But he then started to perfect a form of finer porcelain, and he shifted to porcelain. He called it Stoke china, but its name changed eventually to bone china because he had discovered a new formula adding far more ash bone to china than before, and it's that made it so strong. And that's the formula of bone china that's still used in England today. After Josiah Spode's unexpected death in 1797, his son, Josiah Spode II, took over the firm, and he was the perfect man for the job because he had spent a lot of time in London and understood how to market his wares to the fashionable London market of the 18th century. He was a brilliant salesman who transformed Spode into the largest pottery in Stoke-on-Trent at the height of the golden age of English ceramics, and he himself went on to be named Potter to the Prince of Wales. And the pattern books from those days show that Spode offered 5,000 standard patterns, not including special orders that they would happily take on commission. Spode launched a staggering amount of new patterns in botanical themes, oriental themes, various landscapes, often using new books of engravings that had been published at the time. For example, the Caramanian series shows over 12 different views, which are all taken from Luigi Mayer's 1803 Views in the Ottoman Empire. I've just realised that I don't have any examples of the Caramanian series, so now I feel as though I need to go on eBay as soon as I finish making this video. Their blue and white chinaware was considered the finest in production, and the most famous pattern within it was the Italian pattern that was launched in 1816. And this pattern is still being produced today. Launched in 1816, still going strong in 2020. It shows an idyllic Italian landscape with Roman ruins in the background, little figures in the foreground, and some sheep scattered here and there. This is a modern version of the Italian plate. You can see the ruins, there's always a castle in the background, and there always appears to be a man. I think it looks as though he's pushing a woman into the river. Maybe he's trying to pull her out, who knows? And sometimes there are 3 sheep, sometimes there are 2 sheep. There's a few cattle going into the river, and somebody, I think, reading in a grotto. And the landscape is framed with an 18th century Imari Oriental border. And you can see that lovely 18th century Imari border, giving rather an exotic touch. Here's a little jug of the same design. Again, this one is modern, but it just shows you how many different sizes they need to make the same image in to be able to produce every different type of chinaware. And if you look at Italian patterns from different periods, there are little idiosyncrasies. The number of sheep change, the style of the castles in the background change. And here is an older version of the same design, because this one is from the Copeland factory, So sometime between 1846 and 1966. And you can see that it's quite different from the modern one. The castle in the background is very different. It actually looks much more like a church spire than in this one. It's an Arcadian idyll which has been speaking to people for centuries. Josiah Spode II had been in partnership with William Copeland, and on his death and the death of Copeland, the factory was bought by William Copeland's son and his business partner, Garrett. So from 1833, Spode was actually marked Copeland and Garrett. In the Copeland and Garrett period, yet more patterns were added to the books. For example, between 1832 and 1834, Findon published his landscape and portrait illustrations to the life and works of Lord Byron, and the company used a lot of these images on more of its transferware. Here you can see an image called the Italian city of Bologna at the foot of the Apennines, because this is one of the places that was important in Lord Byron's life. In 1846, Copeland bought the company outright, and from then on and for 4 subsequent generations until 1966, the pieces were marked Copeland, which is why it can be confusing sometimes, because you can find a piece that looks like Spode, but it might be marked Spode, it might be marked Copeland and Garrett, or it may simply be marked Copeland. But it's all the same factory running continuously from 1733. Copeland made spectacular pieces of porcelain of the Victorian era. They exhibited in the great exhibitions of London and of Paris. And between 1833 and 1900, 35,000 new patterns were introduced, which is a rate of 10 per week. I can't imagine any company today being quite that prolific. In 1958, a room called the Blue Room had been established at the Spode factory in Stoke-on-Trent as a kind of museum of all of the extraordinary blue and white transfer patterns that they had been making there for centuries. And because of the beauty of that Blue Room museum within the factory, in the 1990s, the then managing director of Spode decided to relaunch a lot of those classic transferware designs under the new name, the Blue Room Collection. And that's the collection that I was buying with my father back in 2006 in Spode. You can see that on the back, they say the Blue Room Collection, and this one is the image Rome, which was introduced in 1811. And actually, this is my favourite plate in the house. This is the one I usually choose to eat off. I really like the way that the image goes beyond the lip, almost to the very edge. The patterns come in all shapes and sizes. I have some lovely little spice holders. This one is from 1812 and it's called Grasshopper. It took me a while to find him. There he is. And this one is Girl at Well, which was a pattern first introduced in 1822. And you can see from this how styles changed very quickly. The last one was 1822, and this is 1833, and the style of the art's completely different. It's based on the works of Watteau. This one is Portland vase, introduced in 1832, and this is the vase that was so important to Wedgwood and that inspired so many English ceramics. I really, really enjoy this plate because it's so sparse and elegant, spare, but when you look closer, you see how incredibly voluptuous it is. It's really quite naughty for the time. This darker blue one is another favourite of mine. It contrasts very well when there's lots of different types of blue around the table. And this is Botanical, first introduced in 1820. One of my favourite shapes are the modern jumbo mugs that the company produce, again in the old patterns but a new shape. This is fantastic for breakfast and I like to have a lot of tea. This is the Indian sporting pattern that was first introduced in 1807. It's just wonderful. People on an elephant. I think they must be tiger hunting. Oh, that poor antelope looks as though it's just been caught. The hunting itself I don't like, but the prints I very much do. So exotic. Look at this little creature. Does not look happy to be found. This jumbo mug is from the Aesop's Fables collection, and this is the Leopard and the Fox. But there were a lot of prints issued in the Aesop's Fable collection, and there's one of a lion that I really want to get hold of. This one was first introduced in 1830. But the late 20th century was a very harsh time for Spode because advances in computerized printing meant that the skills needed for transfer wear were no longer that important and things could be done far more cheaply. They tried to outsource some of their printing to China to reduce costs, but that just angered their clients, and in 2008 the factory closed after 230 years of continuous operation. But luckily, lottery funding enabled the Spode Museum Trust Heritage Centre to open on the site of the original factory. This was so that the people of England could remember a very important part of their heritage. But funds were very low and not that much was able to be done there. And the museum even now is entirely staffed by volunteers. But the great news is that in 2016, entirely because of donations from the American Friends of the Spode Museum, the Blue Room was able to be opened again, back in the Heritage Museum in Stoke-on-Trent. Everything was unpacked from the crates that they'd been languishing in for nearly 10 years, and they're back on display. If you're ever in Stoke-on-Trent, you can see these glorious works of art that have been created in England for decades, and that reflect changing tastes through the centuries, different influences from various countries, things that people considered fashionable at the time. They're a wonderful part of our heritage and our history. So I don't know who you are, the American Friends of the Spode Museum, but thank you. Next time I'm in Stoke-on-Trent, I'm definitely going to go. Thankfully, in 2009, it was bought by the Portmeirion Group, who are a British company also producing porcelain and who continue to produce many of Spode's most famous works, and are also introducing new pieces to the range. And their factory is only 200 yards from Josiah Spode's original factory. Once again, Spode is being made in England. I hope you enjoyed our little exploration into the world of Spode and beautiful china. If you did, it would be great if you could subscribe to this channel. There'll be lots more like this in future. Now I think I'm going to lay the table for lunch with some really beautiful blue and white china. And I made some napkins in the same fabric as our curtains in the kitchen, which came from another room in the chateau. We had to change the wall fabric, and when we washed it, we couldn't put it back. So I turned it into things for the kitchen so that it would stay in the chateau. And again, it's the great thing about blue and white. It doesn't matter if it's not matching. It doesn't even matter if it's not quite the same blue. Everything can mix perfectly harmoniously together. Now there's one thing missing. We need some flowers, and there's not much in the garden at the moment, but I think I saw that there were daffodils starting in the woods. There aren't many yet, but they'll make a world of difference to the table. There we go, and in this way, a very simple meal of just bread, cheese, olives, some leftover quiche turns into something special. And it doesn't require any more effort than just taking the things out of the fridge and putting them onto the table. The only difference is a couple of flowers and beautiful blue and white china. This really is French life at its finest. I can hear everyone chatting in the room next door. I think they're getting hungry. I better go and call them. I really hope you enjoyed this video, our exploration into the world of Spode. If you did, it would be great if you subscribe to this channel because every new subscriber really helps us in our restorations here. And I want to give a heartfelt thank you to all of our patrons who make this vlog and the renovation of this chateau possible. Thank you to our Marquis and Marquise of Lalande, Brian Woodward and Caroline Forster, and to all our Counts and Countesses of Lalande whose names you'll see here. Thank you to all of our patrons. See you next week.